We are back talking week 13 wide receivers. Jim McCormick here with his sidekick, Ricky Sanders. I've said Jim McCormick's my sidekick before, but I'd like to be more accurate this time around. I have no problem being the Robin to his Batman. But before we go saving Gotham with our picks, how about all those puns or those word plays? But anyways, before we get into that stuff, I'm going to attempt to get this picture up, and we're going to do it flawlessly this time. Look at that. Big Game 51, sponsored by RotoCurve, rotocurve.com/big-game. You can win free tickets to this event by going to this website, plus some fan experience events. 4-night trip to Houston, of course, February 2nd to the 6th. That is when it is. You get 2 tickets upgraded to the lower level end. VIP tickets to go to the Antonio Brown celebrity game, an $800 airfare credit, all you can eat tailgate, Prime Sports Club pregame party with Joe Montana and Warren Moon, 2 of the best to ever play the game. I am one of the best with one of the best to ever analyze the game. So Jim, why don't you tell me about wide receivers this week? Kind of like at running back, we got a conundrum with 2 of the best, although I will say that it is not impossible to fit both of them if you want to go that route. But let's say you can only fit one.
Yeah.
Who do you like this week?
I like Julio. To me, it's like almost a three player conundrum between Evans, just because of his market share is so crazy, and Brown, obviously, Antonio Brown. And what we saw Terrell Pryor was able to do last week against Jenkins, and just the fact that he's Antonio Brown and his market share is so awesome. But it's Julio Jones for me. Where he lines up on the right side of the field is actually where he'll face Phillip Gaines, unless they move things around. They haven't moved Marcus Peters around this season to shadow. So, I mean, Phillip Gaines, as we know, got absolutely torched last Sunday night. He ranks 118th out of 120 cornerbacks in coverage grading on Pro Football Focus. He's allowed 17.7 yards per catch when targeted. That's what I think it's like 3rd highest on their index. So, this could be one of those infamous huge Julio outings. Pat Thorman of Pro Football Focus it's somewhat anecdotal, but it's interesting that like any of his bad games, basically, Julio have been directly followed up by like a game where he's had like 8 for 130 and a touchdown, like is the average. So one of these things where he's a peak and valley player, there's no doubt about it. He doesn't have the weekly line that Evans and Brown do each week right now, but the setup's really sweet. Kansas City's allowed 10% more receiving yards to any other team, to receivers than their team, 22% more than league average to the position. So you're talking about a 20% advantage matchup-wise. DVOA-wise, they're really bad against receivers. Teams are avoiding Marcus Peters, but the same thing, like I said, they move Jones around enough. And he's enough of a discount, really, for in terms of he's cheaper than Brown, that he's who I'm siding with in cash. Who are you taking of this duo or even trio of elites?
I like Julio Jones. I'm with you. Le'Veon Bell has been seeing such a huge portion of their target share, and the fact that the Giants have 2 of the better corners in the league. And now I'm not really worried about Antonio Brown, but on a week with this many games that are looking pretty good, I do worry a little about having too much exposure to the Steelers, where there are some other guys that are going to erupt. And I think Julio Jones is definitely one of them. I'm not worried unless, Jones is facing one of maybe the best 3 or 4 corners in the league. I think Cooper, if off the top of my head, I'll double check it right now, but I think he's in the teens or low 20s in terms of coverage on Pro Football Focus. When you start getting down that low, I'm not freaking out about Julio, at all. I think this is a big game for Matt Ryan. We went over it in the quarterbacks that we kind of like all the top guys this week, and he's definitely one of them against the Kansas City team. All right, so let's see. Marcus Peters, 26th in terms of coverage on Pro Football Focus, so definitely outside the realm of where I'm worrying here. I think Julio Jones is my guy. Taylor Gabriel has been impressive, and that's probably been eating into it a little. At least maybe it did last week with those 2 screens that he took to the house, which took away, some opportunity for Jones. But you look at the 2 weeks before, he had at least 26 fantasy points in both. So it's just a 1-week bad week. I don't think all of a sudden Taylor Gabriel's turning into Roddy White, where you're worried about him taking targets or anything like that. he is scoring a fair amount, but this is a very good passing game. So I love Julio Jones. And then other guys that I think you can use to fit these guys that are at least, mid-tier values. I think Doug Baldwin, who ranks as Pro Football Focus's number one individual matchup of the week. I know the volume isn't there per se, but I do, we already went over it that I like Russell Westbrook. And again, this matchup against Leonard Johnson,
Wilson, but
literally,
yeah, same thing.
what, yeah, what did I call him?
Westbrook.
Oh man, I'm back and forth between these
The
sports. Yeah,
triple.
Russell Westbrook
He's gonna
throwing to
have. He's
Doug
gonna have a triple.
Baldwin.
He's gonna have a triple double.
I'm just lucky I didn't
The
call him
triple double for quarterback is 300 yards passing and 2 touchdowns.
Exactly. I'm just lucky I didn't call him Akeem Olajuwon or something. I'm way all over the place with all these sports. But yeah, Russell Westbrook throwing to Baldwin. I mean, Leonard Johnson, one of the worst corners, literally plays solely out of the slot. So he's going to see a ton of Doug Baldwin. And I'm going straight from this list. I mean, I kind of wrote some articles this week before this came out, but I was looking at these individual matchups. I mean, Pierre Garçon and Willie Snead are the guys in cash.
Love Willie Snead.
If you're going cheap, I mean, those are the guys I like. Andre Diggs out of the slot. Willie Snead gets, he's been targeted at least 7 times. I think 3 of his last 4 games. Let me just double check that because I'm working off the top of my head. But
he's been busier.
Yeah, he's been seeing a fair amount of targets, and you look at this defense. I mean, Darius Slay has been very good. I think that's part of the reason the Lions have been so good. Yeah, 3 of his last 4 games, exactly 7 targets. He's been targeted at least 7 times in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of his last 7 games, and for at least 14.8 fantasy points in 2 of the last 3. So Willie Snead has been pretty good. He's going to avoid that matchup against Slay. And, Brandon Cooks wasn't targeted last week, which probably means he's going to see a huge target share this week. But I just don't think, of these guys, he's safe enough. Just, having seen that. That being said, I'm going to load up on him in tournaments, but I think Snead out of the slots, just, the safest bet to see. Get double-digit fantasy points like you're going to need, maybe score a touchdown or 2. And then Pierre Garçon, I mean, you analyze that Arizona matchup, and usually Jamison Crowder is like the no-brainer on that team that you start. But drawing a matchup against Tyrann Mathieu, I think he's going to have a hard time racking up the receptions this week. I think Deshaun Jackson's going to have a hard time against Patrick Peterson. So by default, if this offensive is going to move at all, because I don't, necessarily love Rob Kelly this week either. I think Pierre Garçon could see double-digit targets, so I like him for cheap. Is there anyone else you like as kind of a bargain in cash to make everything work?
I don't mind Tyler Boyd in cash, just because I think, there's going to be enough of a target share. I do think that it's going to be difficult for LaFell and him to both enjoy big games, especially like they're going to try to feed Hill a lot, so the volume won't be there. But the thing with him is he's very that versatile kind of deployment. You can move him around. 2 weeks ago, he had 6 receptions against 6 different defenders. I think Dalton almost had a perfect rating targeting him. I think over the last 2 weeks, Dalton has the highest QBR targeting him versus anybody else on the team. He's like a high percentage guy. He's not going to wow you, but I do think he's shifty enough from his days at Pitt and even so far in the league to an extent that if he lands, it's also about Jalen Mills. I mean, Jalen Mills is 120th out of 120 quarterbacks on Pro Football Focus. So that's not good. He's worse than Gaines. He's worse than anybody, obviously, in terms of their grading. But it makes sense. He's a 7th-round corner from LSU. He had some issues in kind of hip movement. They don't know if he's a safety or a corner. It's looking like he's not a very good corner. My point being, if they can move him around, match him up in those kind of advantageous matchups, even Lotus McKelvin's not very good. So, yeah, I think Boyd's a guy who could get 8 to 10 targets. He had 9 last week. He's going to be a guy who's going to be busy. I just think it's a really cheap way to get yourself 9 to 10 targets. And I think his floor in DraftKings particularly is pretty high. I think 6 for 80 or 6 for 70 is fairly expected. So what's that, 13, 14 fantasy points? I think that's expected for him. That's returning value for what you're paying.
Yeah, and 2 guys I want to mention just as kind of honorable mentions that you could use if the others don't fit. Marcus Wilson, who saw a bunch of targets. I mean, if we're on Matt Barkley, he was targeted 11 times.
Yep.
Kind of looked like the number 1 option in the offense. And Tyreek Hill, assuming Jeremy Maclin is not active, I feel much better about him. If Maclin is active, I think he's a tournament-only guy for me.
Yeah, I avoid the – because I agree. The Kansas City can't sustain 2 receivers, nevertheless, usually 1. So, yeah.
So there you go. Let's move on to tournaments because there's a lot to like in tournaments. I just want to start off
Sure.
kind of like Pfeiffer and I said yesterday. Start all your Lions and your Saints. It doesn't matter. Marvin Jones, technically a difficult individual matchup, only 4,400 on DraftKings. Got to use him. Brandon Cooks wasn't targeted last week. There's a good chance that means that, because he was disappointed in his role, they get him the ball this week. Michael Thomas has been used as their number one wide receiver. Guy looks like a monster. Even because he's a difficult matchup, if there's a lot of points, he'll probably get his. You look at, again, the Lions, Golden Tate. I mean, that's a guy who eats up receptions in games that are fast-paced. Anquan Bolden occasionally finds the end zone. I mean, you could start any of these guys. I think it's a mix and match of kind of who you like and personal preference. And I think if you're multi-lineuping, a great thing to do is just, match Cooks with Tate and then match, Bolden with Thomas and just, try and find combinations where you're going to maximize points in this game.
I agree. You want to get multiple angles into that game. It's difficult to tell what Saints receiver is going to go off. It's difficult to tell what Lions receiver is going to go off each week, but having shares is going to help. Cooks, I agree. I think there's a recency bias angle we can take. He's one of these guys that I almost feel like we're talking about recency bias so much that he might actually have stronger ownership, just because of how kind of public this is, right? This idea that he's gonna be a fade that so many people, you know what I mean? Kind of like the counter to the recency bias trend. But yeah, Cooks at home, 21 yards per catch, 5 of his 6 touchdowns at home. He's a great pickup. I like the upside that we have there. I love Baldwin too as well in tournaments, even because I know he's also reasonable in cash, but there's something just to his profile with his multiple touchdown kind of profile, and it's not a small sample now. Going back to last season, he's got one of the higher kind of scoring ceilings in the league. I really appreciate that. These are guys that I like. Unfortunately, some of the guys that I like for their ceilings are playing on Monday night. If you're playing in a tournament that includes Monday night, I like both, Hilton and Marshall. I particularly like Marshall just because I think his matchups, we know Vontae Davis is banged up again. Even if he plays, I love the volume and the price. I know we're both kind of apologist for Brandon Marshall, but last week he looked really good. He would have had a second touchdown if Fitzpatrick wasn't Ryan Fitzpatrick. But yeah, no, he's a guy that I like. I also like Jordan Matthews to an extent. I mean, it looked like Jordan Matthews will be available this week. I like him in cash as well, but I like him enough in tournaments, especially in PPR formats, in Draft Street, in DraftKings, in rosters. Just the fact that he's averaged 23% of the targets, and he's really like the early only read that they're looking at there. I like that. I appreciate that he's that guy. Is there anybody else that you're looking at in terms of tournaments that it's disappointing because Tyrell Williams I think would have been a guy that a lot of people would be on. But if he lined up with Hargraves or was able to get those advantageous matchups, because I know they move him in the slot a lot too, the way they did Keenan Allen, but it seems like their shoulder issue is pretty significant. What's your take on San Diego's offense?
Well, if he sits out, I mean, I think there'll be some volume for Dontrell Inman if you want to go
Right.
that route.
Yeah, cheap.
Probably some to the tight ends. I mean, Gates and Henry. So I think, for tournaments, those guys would be in play. They're not really one I'm focusing on. I think for tournaments, one guy who's standing out to me now with Devontae Parker unlikely is Jarvis Landry, because I think some of his volume could be back in that case.
Right.
Lining up against Gerard Powers of Baltimore. We've already discussed that Baltimore number one rushing defense and number one against tight ends. So wide receivers are definitely the way to beat them, which means that this could be like a throwback game to last year for Landry. I actually love him in tournaments. I think we could see, close to 10 receptions once again, which we have not seen a lot of this year. And then Mohamed Sanu, because you mentioned recency bias. I think a lot of people are feeling Taylor Gabriel now. And I know a lot of us are feeling Julio Jones. But Sanu's had some sneaky good games along the way as well. And he draws one of the better matchups, Phillip Gaines on Kansas City. So I think, Gabriel's going to have a lot more ownership than Sanu, and Sanu's going to end up being the superior play. You can quote me there. There's one that I thoroughly believe in. Besides that, there's two decent mid-tier names that I like. I like Michael Crabtree, and I like Emmanuel Sanders this week. Demarius Thomas. The problem with projecting Denver is they all move around the formation so much that you look at these individual matchups, they don't really mean a whole lot. But what I like about Sanders is he ranks second in the NFL in red zone targets. I mean, with this game being the lowest over under of the week, you're like no one's going to be on any of them. But I think, if you look at this game, there's got to be one play that comes out of it, and I really like Sanders. Who has seen more targets, and I also like Michael Crabtree because I don't believe that Latavius Murray is going to be able to get it going in this one, and Crabtree draws the better individual matchup of the two. I mean, Cooper, decent matchup against Gilmore as well. But Corey White, not exactly a corner who scares me. Crabtree kind of hasn't gotten it done in a while. I think he's kind of the red zone target here. Crabtree, especially on FanDuel, that price is great. I'll give you the exact number. I had it written down. Of course, I can't read my handwriting. Crabtree 6,400. So you're looking, less than Doug Baldwin, less than Stephon Diggs.
Right.
Significantly less than Fitzgerald. I really like that price for him for tournaments, and he's kind of a guy you could fill in as your wide receiver 2 or 3. But that's really it for me in terms of wide receiver. I'm pretty much focused on the great games, the great players, and then some fill-ins here and there. Did we miss anyone at wide receiver?
No, that's it. I like all those guys. I also like Emmanuel Sanders a little bit here. I know Simeon's banged up, but even if Lynch played, I like him enough just to go against if he gets lined up with Devon House. And just the fact that he's the vertical guy there, and the price, especially on DraftKings, is cheap enough that the idea being, I know he just had his big game last week, and he's kind of a peak and valley guy himself, but there's some interest there, I think, in kind of having a big game. Especially, I just think how dominant this Denver defense could prove with their pass rush against this sloppy Jacksonville offense, that there could be kind of an added possession kind of angle there, but. I'm mostly sticking to the plays we've already discussed, and I also think it's one of those weeks where there can be some real transition between cash and tournament. Especially with the Julio Jones, even Boyd, and the Saints and Lions guys. Particularly with the Saints, I think Snead's a guy who can transition between cash and because of his price and tournament. But yeah, it's a week I think that I want to be able to afford at least one of those super running backs. So. I'm going to be looking to maybe get Jones and then 2 kind of reasonable mid-level receivers. So we covered that.
Exactly. All right, let's end on that note. But just want to, reiterate, Big Game 51, sponsored by RotoCurve, rotocurve.com/big-game. You have the ability to win free tickets plus a fan experience events, which includes, the 4-night trip to Houston, 2 tickets to the big game upgraded to lower level, VIP tickets to the Antonio Brown celeb game, $800 in airfare credit, all you can eat tailgate, and more. Rotocurve.com/big game. All right, Jim, it's time for us to put it all together and talk about some stacks in our final video of the week.